Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Building Community Capacity Around Housing workshop. We welcome all of you. We're pleased that you can join us. We've got lots of really good information to share with you, and we're looking forward to learning from you as well. Originally, this was planned that we would meet face-to-face, but unfortunately, that's not happening, and so we're obviously unable to do that. We would certainly appreciate everyone if you would put your name and where you're from in the chat box. And as we go along, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and we'll try to respond to them. We appreciate the Southern Rural Development Center for coordinating this. I appreciate our team who has developed the content that you'll be viewing and today and tomorrow. And let me briefly introduce. So this is day one of a two-day workshop. So tomorrow we'll finish the material and lots of good information on both days. Let me briefly introduce the team. So that's me on the far left there. My name is Don Albrick. I'm director of the Western Rural Development Center, located at Utah State University. And Joy, if each of the team will give you a minute or so to introduce yourselves, and then we'll all talk more. So Joy, you're up.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Joy Moulton Thomas, and I serve as the Assistant Extension Administrator in Community Development and Outreach at Fort Valley State University, located in Fort Valley, Georgia. Welcome, everyone.
Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Scoba. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia in a program that teaches housing management policy and community development. I'm also the director of the Housing and Demographic Research Center there. I'm originally from Minnesota and lived in Wisconsin, so I see a couple of my fellow former staters online here. Welcome.
Okay, Vince.
Good afternoon. Vince Palmier, Community Solutions Specialist with the USDA Rural Development Innovation Center, and I'm based out of Ohio. So glad to be a part of this great team and looking forward to spending some time with you guys the next couple of days.
And Allison.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Allison Davis. I'm a professor at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Kentucky, and I direct our Community and Economic Development Engagement and Research Center here as well. So good afternoon.
Well, welcome. So as this slide shows, what we plan to do today is learn the role that housing plays in community and economic development. And this is with my job, I do community and economic development in the West, and one thing that I've learned again and again is the critical role that housing plays. We're going to discuss the factors associated with rural housing: quantity, quality, price, community amenities, and we're going to explore available data and provide guides to decision making. And one thing that'll come out of this is everyone will know where to find data that can be of useful to you in your community. Okay, so let's get going. I'll turn this over to my team at this point.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to start by providing a bit of a foundation about why housing matters. And if you're joining this, you maybe understand this completely, but I think going to think through some of the important and salient points about the importance of housing in our lives will be helpful sort of in conveying that message. I think for people who've never had a struggle obtaining housing or maintaining housing, I think it's kind of a taken for granted situation. And so we're just going to give an overview to get things started. So next. So I think this idea that everyone needs shelter is, intuitive, and we don't think there's much of an argument about what that is. But I think we think about what type of housing is most appropriate, and and for whom. I think that's where some of the deeper questions lie. And so we're going to talk today, and we can think about what are the benefits of home ownership versus renting. For some people, renting is clearly, maybe a better option or the available option. And so thinking about housing in terms of not just this gold standard of achieving home ownership, but also, some other options for people of various incomes and household sizes. And so I think about an ideal community might provide this whole range of options. Next. So I do research on various housing issues and teach housing. And I think the thing that has really captured my interest, and the thing I think is exciting about working in the housing field and community development, is just the numerous ways in which, or kind of levels in which housing plays a role. And so from the personal, the meaning that your home has for you, or the identity that sort of forms about where you live, and well-being of households, but also then the creation of wealth, maybe for homeowners, to then at the neighborhood level, thinking about how the neighborhood conditions, access to services and education, how important those are in our lives, then to local economy. So if we're talking about economic development, that ability to create jobs, but also attract jobs, having an adequate stock of housing is important when attracting businesses to an area. And then, of course, property taxes form a significant source of revenue for for all municipalities. And then finally, the national level, thinking that of the ways in which housing is a measure of our economic kind of well-being, thinking of housing starts or home ownership rates are often used as measures. Next. And then the other piece that I think is really interesting. So if we think of housing as sort of a product or a thing that consumers, buy or rent, I think is limiting, and housing goes so much further beyond that. So if we think of this psychological or emotional attachments we have to home, that's different from other things that we spend our money on. And even different than other basic needs. It's heterogeneous, so there's, even in a neighborhood where all the housing might have a similar floor plan, that people make their own mark on that and change how they're housing over time. So things are, even the same house can be different than the neighboring house with the same floor plan. Some other unique characteristics, it's certainly the largest purchase or largest portion of household income tends to go towards housing. Think about the high cost of moving, or the role of moving. So unlike other products or things that we consume, when you consider moving from one place to the next, there's not only a financial cost to that, but also an emotional cost. So if you've ever moved from a house that you lived in or an apartment that you lived in for a long time, you know that's often there's some loss that when you move from one place to another. And I think that's one of the other unique aspects of housing. It's durable, and so when we think about making decisions about housing, we think about how long-term decisions, because housing often lasts for hundreds of years, and so a decision made today is will be with us for a while. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit later about how housing is shaped by cultural norms and institutional practices. Okay, next. Okay, we're going to attempt to show a video. It's put up by the Urban Institute. I think it does a really nice job of capturing the importance of housing in a community.
Okay, hold on. Does it work?
For anyone to be successful, we need to have a place that we can put our head every night so that we can wake up in the morning and think about, what do we want to do? Where are we going to go? How are we going to make a difference in the world? Having that foundational home and having services connected to your home allows families to get the resources they need for job sustainability, healthcare, transportation.
Everything that we care about as a nation is actually tied up in this housing question.
Housing was meant to be a platform. It was supposed to be a jumping off point where people could secure themselves, and then from there, you could be able to do more.
I'm now seeing really positive steps where housing organizations are reaching out into the community and making really valuable connections. The healthcare connection is a natural fit.
The health systems are strapped in terms of financial realities, and they're looking for, how am I going to save money? You provide me with an opportunity to save money. Now we have a match. We've got to figure out how to get those incentives aligned, because then we're going to have real traction.
At Bath Housing, our maintenance staff are going out into the communities to look at the home and how we can make minor modifications to make the home safer. We're seeing tremendous impact for a small investment when we combine housing and healthcare.
For low-income communities and families, housing is a great stabilizing force. It gives you a place, and it gives you an ability to build community and support your household.
We're partnering directly with households and families to be able to learn from them about what's working and then drive investment towards them. We need to put residents at the center. We need to learn from them. Putting power back in people's hands so that they can really drive that change inside of their households, then a path appears.
I do believe the American dream is every person should have a chance to succeed. If they work hard, if they come to school, they should have a chance to learn. That's the fundamentals that have always brought us together as a country.
Kids spend 80% of their time outside of a classroom. In order to really close the academic and achievement gap, we're really talking about impacting kids where they live. And so the fact that housing has made a decision to not just provide a unit, but to actually think about how to impact a young person's life is just exactly what schools are looking for.
Low-income families have needs that are an integrated whole. And so I think the challenge for 21st century policymaking is to create a system that meets families where they are.
Housing is the foundation of the community. It's the central point for interaction. It's where history and culture is ingrained. It can be the foundation or the basis to build upon.
My vision of a strong community is an understanding that we can't do this alone. There's a value in partnering with other people, that we are empowering and seeing the value of our residents and our families, and that they're strong, amazing people who just need to give an opportunity.
Okay, so I like that video because I think it just talks about the connections between the many different aspects of and that role of partnerships and its importance. Let's see, so what yeah, so I think we look at the whole, we can see that connection to between housing and social and economic outcomes. There's quite a bit of research looking at housing stability and instability and its impact on mental and physical health, education, and school stability. So there's relationships between all of those. And then looking at that role of housing in terms of economic development. Okay, next. So I thought I'd take, maybe think about this for a minute. So my question to all of you is, when you think about ideal housing for your community, what does it look like? And so maybe we can have you type in answers in the chat space if you're willing to, but maybe think about that for 15 seconds and we'll see if anyone's willing to put that in the chat. This is our first time trying this question. So and do you have you thought about what what changes might happen or what the situation might be? Yeah, I'm going to read some of these things. So someone's saying home ownership options, housing with walkable streets. So there's a lot of different ways, what is ideal might look different based on the community, and we even have personal preferences. So if you want to keep adding those, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. So go ahead. And so I think this is important, especially if you're, going out in your community and maybe, trying to form partnerships or get a group of people together to, address housing challenges. When people think of their ideal housing or what their community should have, it's often shaped by cultural norms. I'm seeing some answer, like this idea of diverse as the population. But people, the stakeholders in your community might really be approaching this from a perspective of the cultural norms that are in the United States. So the norms of housing in the United States look a lot more like the picture here. So a single family detached home, it's owner occupied, and so those reflect norms in the United States, which favor home ownership. They favor single family housing over multifamily. They favor large, sort of the United States, bigger is better. And so often, sort of normative housing is like 3+ bedrooms. And those norms that we have are reflected in our zoning ordinances and land use patterns that may have minimum square foot requirements. They may really allot more land for single family housing compared to multifamilies and not allowing much of a mix. And so that is, I think oftentimes the resistance that comes from any sort of change often stems from these beliefs about how housing should be or what the vision of ideal housing is. But that doesn't always reflect the diversity of the community or what is appropriate or possible. Okay. And so if we think about exploring a whole range of options, we might start by looking at, where is there a mismatch between the housing stock and housing needs? And that might be a window into what that wider range of housing options might be. And so when I talk about the mismatch, I'm going to give the example of a few data points at the national level. So on the housing side, when we at the majority of housing units in the US are single family homes. The median size of a new home in the United States is over 2,500 square feet. And that number has risen over time. The homes today are much bigger than they were in the 1970s and even, from the 1950s. So over time, we've seen this steady increase. 90% of new housing in the United States that's built 3 or more bedrooms, single family homes. And then the median sales price last year was over $300,000. So that's sort of the housing stock side. But when we look at households, household sizes are small and getting smaller. Over a quarter of households in the United States have one person in them. The median size household is just a little over 2 people. And then you put look at the large aging population and the needs that they may have, and you look at how that might not necessarily fit with the housing stock that's available, what that wants and needs may not fit. And then just a simple comparison of kind of median income towards median sales price. You can see that $60,000 median household income is not affordable for that median sales price home is not affordable. Okay, next. And so increasingly, the sort of buzzword, I think, in the new buzzword in housing is this idea of building more missing middle housing. And I think this is a great graphic. It really shows this bridge between single family detached housing to mid-rise multifamily and all of the different options that can be, placed in any given neighborhood, from duplex to triplexes to even kind of smaller apartment, bungalow style or courtyard apartments and or accessory dwelling units. And hopefully these also not only represent a range of housing structure types, but also levels of affordability. This sort of picture looks familiar. It's something that older neighborhoods have built in. So if you look, large city neighborhoods tend to have that mix of housing, and we sort of move away from that. Okay, go ahead. So when we think about trying to bring about change and motivating a group of people in your community, you might start by looking at these questions that kind of point to housing needs. So thinking about who lives in your community, what's the age distribution, what's the household size, what housing types are currently available, what does it cost to rent or own, and how does that align with jobs in the community? People living below the poverty line, how old the housing stock is, and what condition it is, are all really great starting point and data that's fairly readily available. But that's not to say when you get started there won't be some challenges. I think when we look overall, there's just a range of barriers to making progress in terms of local housing needs. The first being a lack of awareness, and that's something that some preliminary data can start to tell that story and increase awareness. Desire that may stem from inaccurate stereotypes about what affordable housing means and perception that people have about living in affordable housing. Maybe a lack of capacity with small rural towns. We really see sometimes there's a small group of people. They might be the people who are doing everything and may not be housing experts, but I think we're here to tell you today that you can build capacity around housing among a group of people who are not housing experts. And zoning regulations also get in the way, and I can't remember last one, that's okay. Oh, lack of skilled labor, sorry, construction. Next. So when you think about changes with those kind of barriers in mind, I guess, thinking about changes in, making changes in the housing inventory, which can be adding new housing or improving the housing that's there. There's a fair amount of research that shows that the best way to get started is having leadership and stakeholders who start a planning process. So they ask those questions, they collect that data, know the community and what the needs are. And that process leads to grant funding or access to federal funding or the recruitment of tax credit, developers who can build tax credit housing, and ultimately leads to inventory change and improves the community vitality. And I'm here, I'll end my portion here just to give you hope that small actions lead to big outcomes. I work with a program in Georgia. We work with many small towns and have really seen great results come out of that process of just a group of people who are not housing experts getting together to talk about housing and their vision for the future. And as a result, very small population communities have built new home ownership, single family homes. They've attracted tax credit, multifamily housing for seniors and families. And so it is just a process that gets, that starts small and really over time lead to bigger things. So at this point, we thought we would collect, gather some information from all of you. I think we're gonna go into breakout groups, but what we're wanting to hear from you is what are the housing challenges in your community? And so by housing challenges, it can be anything from like specific housing issues, there's not enough, or there's too much of this, or it can be sort of less tangible things like resistance or some of those barriers that I brought up in the earlier slide. So we're going to break out. I think there's going to be a facilitator, and we'll spend a few minutes, and then we'll discuss and come back. Well, I can talk a little bit. So our group came up, we were talking about connecting with other towns, and I think that finding partnerships or working maybe regionally or across multiple small communities is a really good good approach. But how do you do that? The stigma of affordable housing, and then the lack of affordable housing. Well, there's a lot of production, but at higher income, targeted towards higher incomes, and then the realizing the impact, the longstanding impact of redlining, were some of the things that came out of our.
This is Don. We communities all over are facing the same thing, and then it's made worse by the COVID pandemic, where lots of people are out of work and unable to make payment, and when the care payments stop.
This is Vince, and both of the communities we talked about were rural communities. And the one, there was too many rental properties, not enough home ownership. The other thing that was brought up was a lack of rental inspections was a high need out there to make sure their rentals are in compliance. And the other community, they were shutting down a lot of the mobile home parks. They lost 120 housing units recently. And one of the major reasons why they lost the mobile parks is due to compliance to septic, water and sewer related issues. So two very good concerns out there in rural areas.
We talked about the missing middle. We have a lot of lower income housing and a lot of higher end of housing, and that middle is not there. We talked a little bit, I know Vince will appreciate this, about one of the communities had a home buyer program that they had a significant amount of funding for, but because of sort of the red tape behind it, it was challenging to get funding out the door to get these people eligible and approved and then approved. And just an overall kind of lack of supply across all types of housing.
For my breakout room, I'm sorry, we all had consensus on the lack of available housing for those folks who make under, I think I used $15 an hour. Where is there's Todd. Todd had a good point. He says, right now the folks that are working on our behalf in Congress are arguing over $600 a week or $300 a week. And he basically doubts that anybody in Congress knows anybody that has lived off of either one of those figures. So unfortunately, our leadership at the top that's kind of guiding housing policy doesn't even have an actual grip on the wages that citizens are living in and trying to survive, which was a very valid point.
Okay. So we are going to talk about housing. I can't even move my own slides. Just give you a real brief kind of overview of what's going on. And I think Kim touched on this a little bit. And then we're going to kind of look at data and then look at kind of existing issues by theme. And maybe you guys will agree with how we've broken it out, maybe not. But let's just start with what are some of the current housing concerns. You guys raised some of them. We know that a lot of our rural counties are poor. A share of those are persistently poor. There is a disproportionate amount of substandard housing in our rural areas. And we hear the question a lot, why don't people who are in rural areas just move to where the opportunity is? And we also then say, well, we don't have a ton of equity in the homes in our rural places. They just haven't been able to hold the value. We haven't necessarily been able to invest in them. And so we don't have equity to pick up and move. So I guess people are surprised that there is in fact a housing deficit across rural America. I don't know why suddenly in the last few years, it has just dawned on me. And in many places where I go in Kentucky, that ends up being the center of the conversation, even though that's not why the communities came together. That just seemed to be an issue that became uncovered and that they decided to focus some efforts on. Rural renters are cost burdened, and rural communities lack investment in infrastructure. And that infrastructure could be anything from broadband to roads to having a safe water supply, or water, sewer, wastewater systems, but we just don't have the investment to create or improve. So what we've done is kind of considered our housing into 4 themes. And the last one is a bit of a catch-all, but we think about housing quantity, which we heard in the challenges, we just are missing housing. Housing quality, so what we have is not to standard, whether it's the rental homes need inspection because they're not being up, there's no upkeep. We have vacant housing, we've got dilapidated downtown housing, but we've got quality housing issues. Our housing affordability, folks are having a hard time renting. And then when Kim talked about the mismatch between median household incomes and the price of a house, we've got affordability issues. And then we've got this entire kind of housing and community space that could be anything from walkability, broadband, land use, enforcement, all code enforcement, all that fun stuff. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through the data. Because no matter what you're going to do or what you're leading in your community, you have to start with some baseline, some basic understanding of where we are right now. Because we don't know where we are right now, then we have no idea what our priorities are, what's the best return on investment, how we know if we've made success. So this is always my section every time I do any of these trainings. It's always really, really exciting for folks. So let's talk about data. So right now, we're going to be able to recognize the factors of housing. So quantity, quality, price, and community amenities. We're going to be able to find data sources and then understand other processes that describe local housing conditions. So what we're asked to do is provide data sources that anyone can access for free anywhere. And that's not going to be a perfect solution. There's just so many local conditions that require access to local information or finding out information from consumers that have to augment what we're collecting from our secondary databases. So here's my proposed list, and I ask if you all think you need additional information, put it in the chat box. So again, we're breaking this down by sort of our 6 areas. So what do I think every community needs to know about housing? What they actually have to have something on a piece of paper that says, this is the description of this area of housing. So I want to know how many single family units we have. And Kim mentioned this earlier as being just, you know, this is just our culture in America, that we just have a lot of single family units. And sometimes we just don't know it until we see it. And it may not just be the number, but it's the share of housing that we need to focus on. What type of housing do we have suitable for an aging population? And this is whenever time I've gone out to community, this is just shocking to me about what folks think, even those who are in that aging category, what they believe they need in their house. And so what type of housing is suitable for an aging population? You know, I feel like I'm almost there, but I really, really want a master bedroom on that first floor, right? I cannot risk going up and down stairs. I should want a small yard because I don't want to be out in the 95-degree heat mowing my yard. So what type of housing do we have for an aging population, and what is the community that surrounds it? What type of lower income housing do we have? And we're just talking quantity right now, but how many units do we have? Where are they located? What is our market rate for multifamily housing? So many times I'll go into a community and they have multifamily lower income housing and not a single multifamily market rate housing unit. And then let's look at our ratio of rent versus ownership in a community. So that's quantity. And Vince, you're still in charge of the chat box.
Yes, and I was getting ready to find a point here to get in, but a couple comments. One is about race should be included as a factor in the housing. And the other is that everyone should always factor in average utility bills. I think those are very good points that sometimes get overlooked. And I think when we talk about affordability tomorrow, that's something we can also bring up again.
Wonderful. Those are great points. Yes. Keep putting them in there. We want to keep adding to this. So then if we look at the quality side, you know, a lot of folks want to say, well, aging homes, you know, you can have aged homes that were well taken care of. And so the age isn't really that much of a factor. Or you can have aged homes that haven't been invested in, and age is a significant factor. We have attributes of the house. That can be anything from bedrooms to a modern kitchen to garage, basement, all that good stuff. Do we have, how many of our housing units are condemned? And then a price. We're going to consider price as a quality point. We have preferences, and this is a really critical piece of understanding what our homeowners or renters want. Where do they want to be? And what type of housing do they want? We recently finished a study, and we'll go through, I'll probably repeat myself, but recently finished a study where they basically said all of our young kids want to own a single family house. And these are older people, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not true. That's not the current trend. And so it was really important that we were then able to go ask those young folks, what do you want? And A, they don't want to take on any debt. They don't want to buy a house right now. And B, they want to have the loft downtown. So it's really critical that it's not what my preferences are for younger generations or vice versa. It is their preference because it's their money and their decision. Looking at cost. And so here we have housing related to income. And we'll talk about that, I think, tomorrow when we look at housing affordability to some extent. We'll talk about where to get those data today. Utilities, so that's exactly what we're talking about here, is one of the arguments for mobile homes is that they're low cost, and that's a great thing. But when you start taking these mobile homes that were built back in the 70s, their utility bills are often larger than either their rental or mortgage payments. And so really taking that in as a tangible cost of home ownership or rentership. Then we look at community, and like I said, this is sort of just like a hodgepodge of everything else that you need to understand. So is it walkable? Do we have sidewalks? Do we need sidewalks? Is there green space? What types of amenities are nearby? Are we close to health and fresh food? Do we have restaurants nearby? Do my people who live here have access to jobs? And do we have broadband? So those are just some. So if you think of others, put them in the chat box. We need to have as many factors in here as possible.
Allison, there was a comment about all the rentals are market rate or higher. And for those of low income, unless they're on some type of assistance program, it's just not affordable.
Right. And I think that's why it's so important that you lay out all the different types of housing that you have, and that you don't just have all market rate or you don't have all subsidized. I think we are just, when we go towards something, we put all of our eggs in one basket because it's exhausting and it takes a lot of energy. And we do that, and then we don't have the other types of units available. So that's very helpful. Local schools, yes, thank you. Definitely what types of schools, and that's fueled by the property taxes that are paid on that house. So the last thing that I'll talk about later today is this future. I get called in to communities a lot to do housing demand studies. And what they do is they use the information from my study to then take it to a developer to say, aha, we have a market for you, right? And I'm very comprehensive in that study because you could swing it any way you wanted to based on the data that you have. But it's important to know what is the projected demand for folks within your community, and to think about what happens if jobs come or go, what happens when the aging population moves on, what does it look like for the younger population, and looking at commuting patterns. To me, commuting patterns highlight a risk of leaving or the potential for coming. And so for me, that's one of the really good indicators of housing demand. And then finally, household size. And Kim talked about this as well. If the average household size is 2, then we don't need to build 5-bedroom houses, right? That just doesn't match. You're not going to sell them. And a developer is no dummy. They know what they need in order to be profitable. So here is where I see getting data to support this information. This is what I use regularly when I do a housing demand study. It starts with a what is, it then goes to what do people want, and then it goes to what can it be. And when it starts with the what is, I rely a lot on the US Census for population, the American Community Survey, which is a total hot mess right now on their new website. And I always rely on collecting local information. Where possible, I'll do a survey of our local residents. I try as hard as I can to get into the local PVA data. So it's not just secondary data, but we're going to start there today. So show of hands, put your hands up if you have any experience working with the new census data website. Tyler, yeah. I hate it. I despise it. I have never found something so cumbersome in my life. However, I'm sure with time, this too shall pass. I was on there yesterday trying to pull some data, and I couldn't get over how bad they made it. And so what I tried to do, I think they thought they were making it better, and I'm sure through time it will get better. It is really hard to figure out where you're going. So I don't want to discourage you from finding data. Just, be prepared to have like one of those squeeze balls, frustration balls that you can go to, because it is so frustrating. So I tried to give just a little walkthrough of it. Hopefully at some point you've accessed American Community Survey data sometime before. We've got the US Census data, and those data are typically going to provide population, race, age, right? And that's what we're getting ready to see for the 2020 census. And they'll do population estimates that are updated regularly. The American Community Survey gets at those household and individual level characteristics across the entire nation. The larger the area, the more often they update the data and the more reliable. So if you're in a big city, they update the data every year. And if you're in a rural county, you get new data every year, but it's a rolling average of the 5 previous years. And the smaller the area, the larger the margin of error. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. So I thought this would be useful, and I should have looked at this yesterday. I actually forgot that I did it. I did kind of a step-by-step on how to get there. So I provide the name, the link to the census data set. I typically will start by the geography and then select a topic. And I took little screenshots here that hopefully, I really should have used this yesterday because it took me like an extra hour to find what somehow I ended up like in some government database. And I was like, I just want to know the race, that's it. And so you'll see, you can search by something. You'll see here, I was looking under Bourbon County, Kentucky, and that's going to be our guinea pig for this particular exercise. Bourbon County is a place I just recently finished a housing demand study for. Thank you, Kim. You should have told me that the other day. Social Explorer. Thank you. We'll have to look at that. And here's what I was looking at for housing topics. So these are all of the variables that are available under housing topics. So you'll see there are housing characteristics, and these are almost all the variables that you should be collecting. Housing occupancy, the number of units in the structure, and so that'll tell you if it's single family, multifamily, and that multifamily will range from like 2 units all the way down to like more than 49, I think. How many rooms, number of bedrooms, and some information on heating, fuel, other characteristics. It'll give information. You'll see here, I'm trying to think if I do this. This is where you'll start collecting all your information. There's financial characteristics that are available as well. So this is going to be where you're going to find all of your housing topics. There are lots of other information that you'll want outside of the housing area that will supplement what you're collecting, but all of your secondary housing data you can find here. So I pulled these data, and again, this is for Bourbon County, Kentucky. It's a relatively rural community, but it's located right outside of Lexington, and so it's got proximity to a more urban area. And these are the characteristics that I collected. So in 2019, the population had declined by a bit. There was just about 20% of the population was 65 years or older. We had about 8,000 households, and the average household size was almost 2.5 people. How many live alone? And this goes to Kim's point. We had 1-person households, so 2,100 households that live alone, living with a spouse, and living with other relatives. So why do these numbers matter? What here in this list would sort of cause your narrative to start shifting a little bit? What do you think here is interesting? And this is, I'm keeping this open. If you think of something, put it in the chat box. But for me, what's concerning is that there's a decline in population, that we have nearly 1 out of every 5 people is over the age of 65. So I want to know, what does housing look like now, and what does it look like for the future? And I see we've got a fair amount of folks who live alone. So where are they living? Are they living in single family units? Or do they have access to multifamily market rate housing? Those are the types of things that I think about. So the number of households dictates the number of houses needed. And in fact, what's interesting in Bourbon County is that the population has declined, but the number of households has increased. And this is, again, very similar to what Kim is saying, is that our household size continues to be smaller. But that's the number we need to pay attention to. Households equals houses. The population change is something a developer would look at, and they're not going to move into an area where they see a significant population decline. Who's going to buy their houses? And living arrangements. So if I'm taking care of an elderly individual, then what type of housing do I need? If I have children in the house, what type of housing do I need? So this is where I start my analysis. So then I want to learn more, and in almost all of our rural areas, this is a standalone question. What do we do with the senior population? And what's in Bourbon County specifically, when we did our survey, 1 out of every 5 surveys was for someone who was over the age of 65. And the question was, what type of housing do you prefer as you're aging? And they all said single family homes with an acre. And I was like, really? Like, that just doesn't seem like it's gonna work out. But it's important to know, if you have, of these individuals over the age of 65, how many of them are living alone, right? How many have a spouse in the house with them, or how many of them are living with dependents, or they are a dependent. So if I've got 829 individuals that live alone that are over the age of 65, then I need to make sure I have special living arrangements so that they feel safe, comfortable, and not isolated, either physically or socially. Okay, any questions so far? Feel free. Everyone's turned off their camera, so I'm just talking to myself, except for Brenda and Tyler. Thank you, you two. This one's for you. This slide's just for you guys. Oh, see, there people are coming back on. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
So I do have a question here.
Yes.
And I think this is a very interesting point, that the people that are living alone and what space they have. I am aware of places where there are really, really big houses and you only see 2 people in that house. Mm-hmm. So, and again, you know, they're able to afford that, and that's their right and all that. So what would be some of the policy in a place where there is a high need of housing to make sure that, you know, there is that kind of balance?
Well, let me open it up for folks here. Have you guys seen any innovative policy that deals with the culture of how folks want to own homes, but also makes them feel safe? You know, one of the things, as folks are thinking, I feel like folks are very risk averse, and they don't want to be first into a new idea. And so when you see kind of new senior living communities, which I cannot wait to move into, but if you see these communities, they're just like, you know, everyone's in my face, you know, I don't have that solitude that I want. But when they start seeing people move in and they see their mental health, you know, being good, they see they have easy access to the hospital, to food, then I hope that's something, but it is a real challenge. And Kim, I know you're getting ready to say something, so.
And I've got my dog snoring in the background.
Oh,
so yeah, so I think similar to that, I think it's a lack of sometimes of experience of seeing models that might be helpful. So one example I think of is like pocket neighborhoods, which are these, you know, infill using small plots of land. You build small homes, they're fairly close together, but it is maintaining a single family home. It's just smaller, and it allows for sort of a sense of community, but also privacy. And I think until people see those develop and get a chance to kind of, you know, experience that, it seems like an idea that, you know, that they would not want. And so, so some of it I think is just exposure to ideas, but the other is, like, in terms of policies, is just allowing a wider range of housing that can be built and not necessarily sort of so subdivided. Having land use regulations are a little more open to mixing different types of housing.
We've had a lot of conversations in Kentucky about those mother-in-law houses, you know, so it's a lot designed for one unit. And now, you know, we've, in some places it's done well, in others it hasn't, to put very lovely smaller units on that property so that the person still has their independence, but that they are in close proximity to family. But that's a policy, local policy decision.
Allison, there's a comment about, utilizing planned unit developments or housing developments built around a communal senior living center. So very, very good. You might want to explain what planned unit developments is, because not everybody might be familiar with that term.
Oh, planned unit development. So usually compared to subdivision developments where there's maybe a uniformity of lot size, and developers are somewhat constrained by, you have to build, this house this far back. Planned unit developments allow more flexibility, and so you can have a mix of housing. You can have varying lot sizes, so it gives the developer more control over and flexibility, I should say. So you could have a wider range of options.
So I just wanted to give you an example of some data that are pulled down from the American Community Survey. And, this comes first page of the housing demand study. Here are how many total housing units we have. Here are how many are occupied. Here how many are vacant. And then here are some homeowner and rental vacancy rates. So, housing units is typically something that we should feel confident in terms of that number represents reality fairly well. But because these data are based on individuals responding to a survey, and in rural areas, it's a small number in a small place. And so as we get to those measures that we expect to be pretty fluid to begin with, those numbers get less and less reliable. So vacant housing units, I have a hard time for the most part saying that this is the number, right? Because what I'll do is put this estimate that essentially 10% of the units are vacant. Well, at any given point, houses can go up on the market. They can be for rent. It could be seasonal, all kinds of reasons for vacancy. But if I look on that second column under margin of error, that's a pretty big margin of error compared to the estimate. So I would say, well, I'm pretty sure, I'm 95% sure, 97% sure that I have somewhere between 714 and 1,144 vacant houses. So that's a pretty big range, right? So the housing units itself is a pretty good number. The vacant housing units then becomes very unreliable. So when we report numbers, a lot of people will just report the estimate, and that's fine. But you have to at least look at the margin of error, because there have been times where the margin of error is larger than the estimate, in which case there is zero reliability whatsoever. That means it's going into negative. You can't have a negative vacant housing unit. So just pay attention to that. So when I look here at these vacancy rates, these do nothing for me, right? I've got an estimate that 20% or 2 out of every, I don't even know what that is, 20% are vacant, plus or minus 20%. So it could be anywhere between 0 and 40%. So just keep that in mind. So one of the things that you're able to find is the year the house was built. Remember, this is a proxy, and it may be a useful proxy or it may be unimportant. We cherish our older houses. They are typically very attractive to home buyers if they are well kept and if the investment in that structure is continued. If those houses are old and there hasn't been investment, then the age is actually a detriment to the home. So what we will typically do is just provide a distribution of housing based on the year it was built. And then, so you can get that from the census, and then you will get the number of units. And so just as Kim had mentioned early on, we are a 1-unit community. And we are here to over 75% of our housing units are 1-unit detached housing. The next largest chunk of homes in the community are mobile homes, and then followed by duplexes. Once we start getting into these multifamily, larger than duplexes, it's a really small amount. And that's just typical, at least for Kentucky rural. The other thing I will pull out is housing costs, trying to get some understanding of both the ownership market and the rentership market. The ownership market, just trying to get some distribution of what housing values are. And what I like to do is put the distribution of housing values over the distribution of household income and see if they are lined up at all. And we find a lot of places who have invested heavily in lower income housing and higher income housing will see sort of this two hump to the housing value. And then if you look at the distribution of income, it doesn't match at all. And so it's a useful kind of putting one on top of the other. The other, the one on the right is looking at rent. And again, this is, do we have options for individuals of all income levels who don't want to or cannot purchase a home? And you'll see here, there's a big chunk of housing up to $999, and the rest sort of fall on either side. Questions?
Sorry. Vince Maloney stated, you can gauge the vitality of a community by the age of the housing stock, 90% older than 1939, with none new as a dying community.
Yeah, I was going to say also that distribution of the rents. Oh, sorry, maybe cutting you off. But no. When we had a number of people saying there's just a lot of development in maybe rental housing or condos that are high end, that distribution of rents is really helpful, especially when you pair that with the income distribution and what people are earning. I think it can really show where those gaps are.
No, the other thing I wanted to add is we work with, rural development works with a lot of communities, and one of the things we've been doing recently is it's ready communities, and going out and talking to these communities about some of their biggest challenges, and housing is usually one of the ones that the community picks to focus on. So I think it's whether you're in urban or rural areas, housing is key to that vitality of that community, just as kind of Vince alluded to right there.
This is another piece that we're going to talk about tomorrow. This is more about affordability, but this has to be in every single report. And this is gauging, we call a housing burden, a time when a household is spending 35% or more of their income on their mortgage or rent. And in this county in Kentucky, what we'll see here is on the home ownership side, it's, there's still 600 housing units where this holds. On the rentership side, that red bar is important. That's a bit of a white elephant that needs to be addressed. If that's the largest share of renters that are facing a housing burden. And I think you can get even more, trying to figure out how much of that is even above 35% or even higher, but that's something that we need to better understand. So that should be, and all of these metrics that we just looked at are all available from the US Census, from an American Community Survey. So then my question is, what else might be helpful to know? And for me, when I work in these communities and we ask those who are organizing, it's typically going to be a conversation that starts from planning and zoning, who's getting ready to do their comprehensive plan, or becoming from the fiscal court, or somebody who is in a position of elected leadership. these are the questions that, we need to better understand. Of our population or our potential population, do these folks want to rent or buy? And thinking that the younger generation wants to settle down and buy a house is just simply not the way things are right now. That trend has shifted, particularly with the large amount of student loan debt. Folks are very risk averse about taking on more debt. Do individuals want to be out in the country, or do they have a preference for being downtown? And there's been a push in the last decade to bring some folks downtown. Not everyone has those preferences, but some do. And so you've seen a lot of revitalization of second-story home, commercial buildings for downtown housing. Do we want ranch-style housing? And that's something that, because of the aging population, you'll have a master bedroom on that first floor, or do we want to have these kind of taller second-story, three-story gigantic homes? How much land do you want? In an era where we just want to have very little upkeep, do we want to have a real nice teeny yard, or do we want to have our 5-acre minimums? What do we feel about code enforcement? Do we have code enforcement? Does it actually work? Do we have subsidized housing? What do our commuting patterns look like? Because what I have told folks who say we're a bedroom community, and that means that a lot of their households are commuting out, to me, that is a risk. Eventually, if they find something they like that's closer, they will move out. And so you're no longer a community to that family at all. So what do those commuting patterns look like, and why? Why are they living here and working somewhere else?
Allison, have a question from Joseph. If the housing is driven by demand, how would home value be inconsistent with income monthly rent? Where would they get the renters from?
Okay, so if the housing is driven by demand, so are you, Joseph, are you asking about sort of the difference in those distributions?
Yes.
Right, so I think the difference there is that what we assume is that everyone can buy a house that they demand. And I think what I would say is that this is actually an interesting question, because in Bourbon County, where these data are from, we had some real estate agents who did not want more housing. I don't know why, but they basically said the market is in equilibrium. Everyone who wants a house gets one. And I say, in this county, or are we talking about regionally? Because what we have heard is that people want a house, they can't find what they want, and then they go to the county next door. And so I think it's at some point, regionally you might have an equilibrium and you would see those things become more consistent. But inside a smaller area, I don't think you have, I think people leave the market. And Kim, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you can look at, HUD has cost burden data for both renters and homeowners by income level. So I think when you look at, so you can see where the gaps are by looking at cost burden renters. And so I don't think there's probably a place in the country that has an ample supply of housing for the people, lower wage workers. And so some of that data can get at that. And then I agree with Allison, when people when they don't have the resources to rent or purchase the house that they need, they it's the drive to qualify. They move far enough out where they can. I think also when we look at, lower income renters, at least in Georgia, we see a lot of people living in extended stay hotels. And so or doubling up with other people. And you can see that even like young adults who are just starting, are they living at home with their parents when they prefer to have their own apartment? So I think there are some things that you can get at with data. There are some portions of the story that aren't really told by some of the data.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that because in the beginning, Kim, you provided some background on what housing means really to people, from emotional to psychological to economics. And if things are like that, you have to leave what you call home because you cannot afford it, you buy somewhere else. How does that, interfere with that kind of psychological, emotional, or all the factors that, what house mean to people.
Amber has a question. In the region I live in, there's housing shortage. However, there's also a lot of programs to subsidize renters. Unfortunately, this results in higher rental prices all around.
I said that more in a response to what Joseph had to say. It's a true observation, but it's a way that increases rental prices beyond like the average incomes, is because a lot of people, what they pay in rent isn't it is based on their income, but that isn't what the landlord is getting. Does that make sense?
You're from Bemidji, Amber? And so there's a college there, there's probably vacation.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors figuring.
And all of those things, right, put pressure on the rental market in a way it's really hard to figure out like what the need is when you have maybe some college students moving in and out, and they inflate rents too. College students tend to, I'm in Athens, and what college students are able to pay is sometimes more than what, even the higher end of kind of working wage families can make. But they're competing it for the same unit sometimes. So,
well, great conversation. Thank you guys. So I just wanted to take some of these questions and maybe provide some ideas about where to get data, and then you guys chime in. You all sound very experienced and seasoned, so please, provide your best practices. So there are some questions that we posed on the previous slide. What else might be helpful? Do people want to rent or buy? Do we think the younger generation is less interested in taking on debt? How does that affect your planning? Do people want to live in the country, or do they want to live close to downtown? And do people want ranch style housing? So where do we find these answers? We do 2 places, and so anything that you guys want to interject is great. One is we do a survey, and we will make sure the survey is widely distributed, both for people who live within a community as well as potential home buyers. And for example, we have school teachers that live outside of the community because they can't afford the current level of housing on school teacher pay. And so we really wanted to see, the community wants to find a way for you to live in this community so that your commute is shortened and that you are part of the community in which you teach. So what does it take? What do you need? And so we do a survey and make sure we reach out to existing and prospective home buyers. We also talk a lot with bankers, not about specific people, but what are some of the trends that they're seeing for individuals who are looking for mortgages. And they can give you a breakdown, of the age of folks that are coming in, the amount of capital they're seeking, what type of home they're interested in, and so forth. They're usually the best source of info in a community. Do we want to live downtown? And what we'll do is track. We can do 2 things. One is you can do a survey, again, sort of see where we put a map in the survey and say, which part of this map are you interested in moving to? Or you can look at previous transactions over the last 5 years and see if there are clusters of sales that have occurred. And you can look at that by, prices of homes to get a better sense of where, homes under $200,000 are selling versus, higher price homes. You can also look at building permits. Where have the recent building permits gone? And you can also, with some of the data from the census, see where people are moving. You can get down to a much lower geographic area, and you can see over time sort of where folks have moved. And then finally, do we want ranch style housing? Well, again, PVA data, we can find out from there where those sales are, what type of houses are selling, and we can survey residents or potential residents. And this question, this is the one that I think Kim alluded to in the beginning, this sort of real mismatch between the desire to keep our farmlands, our rural landscapes in their current landscape form versus wanting to live the American dream. It is just to me, it's just the way things are right now. And every place I've gone, it's been like, don't tear up our American land, our beautiful farmland, but I want my new house with 2 stories on 5 acres of land. And so there's just this tremendous mismatch. And sometimes it's important just to highlight that and to have it in writing to say you just can't have both. And that is what a survey can do, and we'll talk about that as well. How does code enforcement or lack thereof affect the quality of housing? What is the quality of subsidized housing? We talked about that a little bit earlier as a comment. And then, are people commuting into the county for work? And if so, why aren't they living where they work? What are the barriers, obstacles, preferences, etc.? So I've provided again, PVA, Tyler's just nailing us on all of our acronyms today, is the property value assessor. So it's the county level official who collects all the transactions data. Thank you. Keep telling us. Vince here, he's our RD guy. He makes us do all these acronyms. We're not allowed to spell out the words. So again, PVA data, and I don't know how many of you have accessed your local PVA data. Depends if you know the person, you can get it for free. There is a site where you can access recent transactions. There's a site where you can pay for recent transactions. When I work in a community, if they've asked me to do this, I basically insist that they give me their property tax roll as part of the study. One thing that I have learned is that they do not do a good job digitizing their tax rolls. And so when this study we did, they didn't have the age of the house for about 80% of the homes in the tax roll database. So it's not great data, but at least the newer transactions are useful. So we looked in one community at code enforcement violations. Typically, those are available publicly online. They should be available via FOIA if needed, or you can do a visual inventory of housing. There are some communities that have created committees that are like the neighborhood code enforcement committee, and they can have sort of an inventory of violations. What is the quality of subsidized housing? This comes out naturally with focus group or town hall meetings. You can try to get access to logged complaints, and then also through surveys. And anonymous surveys have been a useful tool for trying to figure out what those issues are. And then finally, commuting. That is census on the map. If you guys haven't seen that database, it's really nice, very easy. It gives you some great information about where people are, specifically where people are coming from and where they're going for work. So I think I just need one more minute and then I'm gonna wrap up. So the future, and that's where this is typically going. These conversations emerge because communities are interested in new development, renovated developments, and that new development could be single family housing, it could be multifamily housing, it could be subsidized housing, but they have to have this information about what is the future market for this type of housing. And so this to me is like the crux of the housing demand study. And it's really important to know, what does your projected change in population look like? How would that be affected? Do you have any new industry that's planning on locating? Do you have any industry that just shut down? Make sure we include that in the analysis. And also the final note I will make is be very aware of high vacancy rates. We talked a little bit with the census data not being great, but even you can still get a good sense of vacancy rates. If I know that vacancy rates are high, developers know that vacancy rates are high. They're going to question, why am I coming into a market where there are really high vacancy rates? It doesn't bode well for them if the existing housing stock isn't occupied. And so be able to explain that away, or have a conversation about how do we take the existing vacancy houses, either condemn them, bulldoze them, or renovate them, but that's just typically a big mismatch that's out there. So I will stop there. Any questions, thoughts before? I think, Kim, you're my local guru, so if you have anything you want to add.
No, I think that's great. I'll talk a little bit about collecting data on housing conditions in the housing quality section, which also gets at vacancies for especially single family homes.